everybody. Welcome to City of Peoria's Programming Irrigation Controllers. My name is Andrew Peroni, and today we're going to be talking specifically about programming your irrigation controller or your sprinkler timer at your home and why it's important. So why is it important to understand how to program your timer? Why can't you just leave it as is all the time? Well, the short answer is because we have seasons. We have a change in seasons. We have different weather throughout the entire year. And so the plants, therefore, need different amounts of water, your plants and your lawn, throughout the year. So what are the specific things that affect the plant water needs? Well, it's very important to understand these aspects before we get into putting any information into your controller. So some of the main things, of course, weather, we're familiar with that. That's the season, the time of year, if there's any wind, the actual temperature, which we know a lot about here in the desert, and rainfall. Your soil type is also an important factor in determining how much water your plants need. The soil condition, if it's too compacted or if it's really loose, if you had construction recently, and any soil cover as well. If you have a rock mulch or other kind of mulch on there, that also impacts the water needs of your plants. Your actual plant type, whether it's lawn, whether it's desert plants, whether it's high water use plants, we'll talk about that in a little bit. Your plant size, so the maturity of the plants, the larger plants are going to need different amounts of water than your smaller plants, which also needs different amounts of water than your lawn. And then any microclimates or exposure, so if you think about the east side of your house where it gets morning sun but no afternoon sun, if you have a southern exposure on your home that gets sun most of the day, those are going to impact the water needs as well. Any maintenance practices, so if you have a lot of history of a lot of trimming going on at your home, that's going to impact the water use of a plant as well. Whereas if you have a more natural looking yard or landscape, then typically it's going to reduce your water needs overall. So the main reference that I'm going to be using for this presentation is Landscape Watering by the Numbers. If you have this as a hard copy, you can follow along. I'm going to be referencing page numbers through the presentation. If you don't have this, you can request it through City of Peoria Water Conservation, and you can get one of these because it's going to be very helpful, and everything we go over today is going to be related to this. So the website that you can also find this on if you don't have one handy is landscapewateringguide.com, and you can get the PDF version of that, or you can go through the site as well and follow along. So there are two things that we need to know as we figure out how to program our irrigation timer. The first one is your plant type. We're going to talk more in depth about that. And the second thing is your watering device, or sometimes you'll hear it called an emission device. Basically, we need to know, is it a sprinkler, is it a drip emitter? Even if you have certain areas of your yard where you're watering with a hose, all these principles are still going to apply. Okay, let's talk about plant type. Your plant type is, there's four main common ones here that we're going to be discussing. Warm season grass, that's going to be your Bermuda grass that you'll see almost everywhere here during the summertime. Your cool season grass, that's typically if you do an overseed in the wintertime, usually that's around fall. That's the grass that's green through the winter, where the warm season grass will go dormant and look more of a golden brown. Desert adapted plants, that's going to be the majority of your trees and shrubs in your yard. And then high water use plants, those are your specialty plants like your hibiscus, or if you have a citrus tree, queen palms, those all fall in this category of high water use plants. If you're not sure if you have a high water use plant or desert adapted plant, I would encourage you to reference this guide. This is the Landscape Plants for Arizona Desert. It's another one that you can request if you don't have a hard copy. But you can also go to amwa.org/plants, and there's a really nice comprehensive list there with pictures to help you identify if you're not sure what plants that you have in your yard. So that's the first piece of information we know. So if you're thinking about your yard, think about what sections you have and what kind of plants are out there. And we're going to come back to that. So the next thing is your sprinkler type. So your sprinkler type is also very important to determine how much water, how we're going to program your irrigation controller. First type that's very common is a lawn sprinkler. Another one is the drip emitter. So those are the ones that you're typically going to see on your trees and shrubs. And then you may have some of these out there. They're a little less common, but a tree bubbler. And we'll talk about each of these. Let's talk about the lawn sprinklers first. So lawn sprinklers, very common. You'll see them. Those are the ones that pop up and spray water into the air. Now, we'll talk about a few different kinds of these. The most common one you're going to see is this type. It's a fixed spray head. and that pops up and the water sprays in one direction the whole time. This is considered a high output sprinkler. The second kind are going to be rotor or rotary, rotating. Anything that's a sprinkler head that pops up and rotates, that's a different kind of sprinkler. Typically you're going to see it on your lawns. And these are considered medium output. And the reason is, if you think about it just kind of in a logical sense, when they pop up and they're turning the spray, then it's only putting water over a section of the lawn rather than all of that in front of it at the whole time. You'll usually see these in larger lawns, so you're going to notice it maybe in an HOA or in a park setting. Only if you have a larger lawn area in your home will these make sense. Most of the time you're going to see your fixed spray heads. But if you have these, make note of it. If you have them mixed together on the same zone, that's not a good idea. You're going to want to unify them. Okay, and the third type that we're going to talk about is your drip emitters. So these are pretty common for trees and shrubs. These are the ones you're going to see the little bit of tubing. You may not see the actual drip emission device at the end of your tubing, and that might be because it's just buried underground. But don't worry, unless it's spraying really high in the air, it's just likely buried and you're still getting a regulated flow. These are considered low output, and you can see here that there's several different flow rates on there. The flow rates will impact how we want to water, so if you don't know the flow rate, we'll talk about some ways to potentially figure that out, but a lot of times it might actually be stamped on your drip emitter. The best drip emitters to have are going to be labeled pressure compensating. And basically what that means is the pressure at the beginning of the line and at the end of the line is going to be much more even. So if you have your water source at one point at the beginning, and then you have a drip emitters all along the line, there's a potential that that last drip emitter may not be getting enough water unless you have drip emitters labeled pressure compensating. So many of you may have some like this, where you have the little flag on the top, or you might have those adjustable emitters. So if you're looking at these and you're like, oh yeah, those are the ones I have, wrong. It's okay if you have them. We can still work with them, but the ultimate goal would be to get them to be pressure compensating. These types are not, so the danger of having these is that you really don't know how much water they're putting out, which makes programming your irrigation timer much more of a guess. Okay, and then bubblers. Typically you'll see these on really large fruit trees or citrus trees. These are the ones that sometimes you'll hear them called flood bubblers, and they really do flood, especially in our soil. It's okay as long as you have a basin to collect it. But we need to know if we have these, it's going to impact how we water. These are also considered high output. They have about the same output per sprinkler as a fixed sprinkler head that you would have on your lawn. So just keep that in mind in terms of when we're programming. One important thing to note, all of the devices we've talked about, when you are purchasing them at a hardware store or an irrigation distributor or online even, the best devices that are going to work for our area are pressure regulating or pressure compensating. So basically that just means it's going to even out the pressure through your system. Most municipal water systems are going to run at a little bit higher pressure, and that's when you'll notice misting and things like that. Misting is fun to run through, but it really doesn't help your plants and your lawn because that's just water lost to evaporation. So if you have pressure regulating and pressure compensating, that's going to maximize the amount of water that actually goes from the sprinkler itself or the drip emitter even into the actual soil where the roots are for the plants. Okay, so let's review what the information that we have now. So think about your yard, you thought about the plants that you have, thought about the types of sprinkler or drip that you have. We have our plant types, we have our sprinkler types. So good, now we are getting closer to being able to actually program the controller. Now, when you think about your yard, you'll probably recognize that you don't have one whole zone for all of your drip and one whole zone for all of your lawn. Typically, it's going to be divided into different areas. So your lawn, you may have 2 or 3 zones that turn on, separate from each other, and the same with your trees and your shrubs. The reason for that is simply the water flow. There's only so much water that can be pushed through the pipe at once, so it has to be divided up. What do we still need? We have, okay, we're great in shape. I know what plants I have, I know the sprinkler types I have, but now I walk over to the irrigation timer and it doesn't have any of that information there. Okay, so what information do we need? What are the inputs when you look at your controller face? And we'll be looking at one later on and putting some information in. But even if you have a different model than the one that we're going to be showing, don't worry, all the parameters are the same. So just look for these things on your controller. First one that everybody really thinks of first is your minutes or your hours to run each station. Usually that's going to be labeled run times or something to that effect. How often? That usually is going to be days. You'll usually see a days of the week, or you'll have a water days setting. All of that is going to be within this category. And then time of day to run, that's typically going to be labeled start times. This is the time you want to tell the controller to begin. So we have to figure out how to translate our sprinkler types and plant types into these three settings. So referencing on page 5 of your landscape watering by the numbers, if you have one, our first question is then, okay, how long do we need to run sprinklers? So if you do have sprinklers and you have a lawn, we need to know how many minutes do we need to run them. The best way to determine that is to do a quick test. If you have any flat bottom cans or Tupperwares you can put out in your lawn, run your lawn zone manually. And what you want to do is essentially measure how much water is falling within those cans. The reason for this is because we'll know how many inches fall in a certain amount of time. That will help us to program your irrigation controller properly with the right amount of minutes. If you think about the reason we measure it in inches is because that's really how the lawn is taking up the water. And typically a sprinkler system is going to put out, if you have fixed spray heads, between 2 and 3 inches per hour. So when you think about a rainfall event, imagine if we had 2 or 3 inches in an hour, it would be a flood, right? But that's how much water your sprinkler zones put out. So that's important to think about when we're programming and putting minutes in there. If you do this test, then you're going to be able to determine how many minutes. This is referencing again now page 7. If you do that test and you have a certain amount of inches that fall in that period of time, then that translates to a certain amount of minutes. That being said, that if you don't have the time or the tools necessarily to do that right now, but you need to get some program in there, we can use some rule of thumbs, which we'll do today. So this is a general rule of thumb. So if you have a regular fixed spray head like we talked about, 18 minutes, that's a little on the higher end, but if you have a large lawn area, that's appropriate. Smaller lawn areas, the sprinkler heads are closer together, you're going to want to take that number down. If you have rotors or the rotating nozzles, you're going to want to at least double that number because they're putting out water at about half the rate. And the way to check this, you can see over there on the step 3, is basically identifying if you're getting a deep enough watering. If you're not sure if you have the right amount of minutes, go out to your yard after you've had a run day and push a long screwdriver into the ground to see if you're getting about that 8 to 10 inches of depth. That's about how much Bermuda grass roots are going to grow. So if you are able to push your screwdriver down way deeper than that really easily, you're likely overwatering. But if you're only able to push it in at a couple of inches through most of your lawn, it's likely you're not watering deep enough. Okay, what about drip and bubblers? Well, before we even figure out minutes and hours, we need to know what type of plant we have, if it's a shrub or tree, and then how large it is. So you don't necessarily have to go out and measure every single plant in your yard, but kind of mentally think about generally how large are your plants, and what we need to know is how many gallons each plant needs. So again, think about your drip emitters. We measure those in gallons per hour. So this actually makes it really easy. This is easier than the lawn because if we know our gallons per hour on a drip emitter and you know how many gallons you need on the plant, now it's just a matter of simple math. Figure out how many gallons, how many hours you need to run your system. So on this screen that we're looking at, identify, let's say you have a 3 foot shrub that you have, it's fairly established, and it's going to need about 8 gallons. So if you think about you have a 2 gallon per hour drip emitter on there, then you're going to have to run it about 4 hours. Seems really long, but that's why we do this math, because that's actually the appropriate amount that your plant will need. So keep all these things in mind as we're going through and programming, and then also keep in mind what plants you have. If you have a really established mesquite tree or something like that, it's unlikely you have to water it 100 gallons each time. This is what we were talking about before with your drip system flow rate. You have to identify how much water your drip system is putting out before we can make a realistic estimate. So that's where I would encourage you to go out there, see what your flow rates are if you can see them stamped on there. You can also use this guide to identify just about how much water. If you're seeing drip very slowly, it's likely a lower output. If you're seeing a stream coming out and then some drips, you're going to have a higher output. If you see a stream and it never drips, then it's probably a little bit higher output than it's appropriate for our soils. But at least you'll know, okay, it's probably higher than 4 gallons per hour. So now this still has to translate into minutes, right? We figured out our minutes for our lawn. So what does that mean for drip? Well, if you have your lawn, your fixed sprays, we talked about that's going to be in that range of 12 to 20 minutes. If you have that rotor or rotating nozzle, at least double that, maybe more if you have a really large lawn area. Drip depends on how many gallons you identified you need, but typically you're going to be running it between an hour or 6 or more hours if you have the really low flow pressure compensating drip emitters. So I would encourage you to just do a stock of your yard. How many plants do you have? What kind of drip emitters are out there? How many are on each one? And then do some quick mental math to figure out how many gallons am I getting per plant. And that will help you to determine your hours of runtime. If you have bubblers, 30 to 60 minutes total. Typically, you might actually want to break this up into more than one cycle, which we'll talk about when we get to the programming portion. Okay, so we have our minutes. Those are our valve runtimes or our zone runtimes. The next piece of our irrigation controller programming is how often. So this is where you come to water days, and we need to figure out how often we need to run each of those particular areas of our yard. So page 18 of your book has this, which is where we are going to reference for our guide. Now this is a pretty busy looking chart. However, if you are looking for a specific type of plant or tree or lawn, find that on the left-hand side, find your season that you're in right now, and then that's going to tell you your days between watering. Now let's take this and kind of break it down just into one section. So let's talk about grass. So this is basically kind of a simplified chart, a little bit easier to read to determine how often we need to run. So you can see based on whether you have warm season grass or cool season grass, it doesn't really matter when you're watching this per se. All you have to do is determine when your season, what season we're in right now, and then figure out if you have warm season grass, if you decide not to overseed or not, and then if you have cool season grass, it's going to be typically a little more often. So for instance, right now, when we're doing this, it's still summertime. Everybody's still going to have warm season grass. And so right now, the recommended days between watering will be every 3 days. So typically what that means is once every 3 days, you're going to water your lawn. So if you've been watering your lawn every single day, then you're likely watering it way more than it really needs in order to stay healthy. But remember, keep in mind, we're going to be watering it those longer minutes each time. Trees and plants, same idea. The principle is the same. Now it's just about stretching it out typically a little bit further. So it is important to know whether you have desert adapted or high water use plants, because your desert adapted plants are going to need water less frequently. So you can see even in the summertime, if they're established desert plants, only needs water about once a week if they're getting a deep enough soak. And your high water use plants still may only need water about once every 4 to 5 days. And then also make a note, if you do have cacti and succulents, really if they don't need necessarily any additional watering unless we go a long period of time without any rain, which is the case that we had this year, you may decide, okay, we're going to give them a deep soak because it's been a month since we've had any moisture. Okay, so you might be thinking, all right, well that's fine. I could think every 4 days, every 5 days, but I only have one schedule on my controller for days. So how am I going to reconcile my lawn only needing water once every 3 days and my your trees and shrubs needing every 7 days? Well, there is a solution to that on your irrigation controller, and it's programs A, B, and C. So typically you're either going to have a switch that you'll see the programs A, B, and C, or you're going to actually have a program button, or it'll say PRG, and if you hit that button, then it's going to switch between programs A and B and C. So optimally, we want to utilize these 3 programs. And if you think about it, you have a lawn program, maybe you have a trees program, maybe you have a shrubs program, maybe you have a high water use program if you have it zoned up in your yard that way. And that's very important because it's going to maximize the plant health, it's going to maximize the water efficiency, because now we can really dial in each of those areas of your yard to the optimal amount of watering. Like we talked about, each of them you could do a custom frequency. Program A can be watered every 3 days, Program B could be watered every 6 days, Program C could be watered, if you have a vegetable garden, every day. So that's the benefit of having these 3 programs, as long as your yard is actually divided up that way. Okay, the third parameter on our irrigation timer now is when to run. We have a start time setting. So we've given it the amount of minutes, We've told it how often we want those to run, but the controller still needs to know when to begin to do this, what time of day. So a lot of times we'll get questions about what's the best time of day to water, depending on what you're watering. Typically for lawn, rule of thumb is when it's dark, because when it's dark you have less water lost to evaporation. If you're going to get more into the weeds with it, then lawn watering, a lot of times you'll hear water in the earlier part of the morning. And in this area, typically you'll have less wind in the AM hours, and so you'll have a less chance of wind drift. But if you water it when it's any time after dark, then you're going to be reducing evaporative loss. So that's a good rule of thumb. Some people get concerned about mold or mildew on their lawn. They say, well, I don't want to water in the middle of the night because then I'll have mushrooms in my lawn. If you're getting any kind of mold or mildew in your lawn in the desert, typically you're overwatering. So I wouldn't worry about that in our area. Typically, if you're doing the right kind of soak, remember we're not watering every day, then you're not going to have any issues with that. What about your drip? Well, drip, the best solution most of the time for drip, because remember you're putting the water right by the root ball of the plant. So typically, if you can run your drip at a time when you might happen to see it run, then that could be very beneficial because you're going to catch leaks. So if you do have a large leak that's happening on a drip system, it's running from your front yard and it's going into the street, and every morning you pull out and say, man, somebody's got a leak. You never know it's you. It's running at midnight. You just see the effect of it. But if you ran that at a time of day where you might be leaving the house, then you'll catch that leak a lot faster. So you say, well, there is some more evaporative loss, but that first leak that you catch, you're going to save all that water that in theory would have evaporated from a drip system. So typically what we'll recommend is watering it at a time of day where somebody might be around your home to catch if there's going to be a leak. Drip system leaks are very common, so this is a good practice to do. It's still okay to run it at night. There's no problem with that, but if you have to pick something to run at night, pick your lawn, and then you can use the time in the day to run your drip. Okay, one important thing to note about start times. Start time is not related to the minutes in your zones. This is a little bit of a complicated thing to try and understand, and certain brands or models of irrigation controllers make this way more tricky to understand. But if you are on the setting, wherever your dial is, if you're on the setting that says start times, then keep in mind it's not related to the minutes. So if one example of this, which we'll go over in just a sec, every time you put a start time in there, it runs everything in that program. If you have a lawn program and you have a start time, it's going to run all the lawn that you've put in there. If you have a drip program and one start time, it's going to run everything in order. So here's an example of what that might look like if it was a confusing input. So sometimes we'll run into this situation. You say, okay, program A, we have a 5 a.m. start time, a 5:30, and a 6 a.m. And then stations 1, 2, and 3 are running 30 minutes. So you might look at this logically and say, okay, that makes sense, right? 5 a.m., 30 minutes. But what actually happens on the irrigation controller? Because we've given it 3 different times to start this program. What will happen at 5 a.m., station 1 will run for 30 minutes. Immediately after, station 2 will run for 30 minutes. And then immediately after, station 3 will run for 30 minutes because they're stacked. And then the controller will say, oh, I have a second one in there. It's 5:30. Is what it's scheduled for. It's now 7 a.m., but the controller says, well, it's in there. I got to run it. Doesn't matter what time it is now. So then it does it all over again. And then you have a third start time in there for 6 a.m. By now it's 8:30. Again, the controller doesn't really care at this point. Now it just says, well, this is a third start time. We got to do it all over again. So now it's running each zone in order again for 30 minutes each. So what actually happened was each zone ran for 90 minutes. Triple what our original intention was. So the main point to remember here is that controllers will stack those start times. If you have one start time, it's automatically going to run everything under that program. So if you add a second start time, which will be appropriate in some cases, like we'll talk about, then that's okay, but just keep in mind it's going to run everything in there again. So typically you won't be stacking it in this manner where you'll have them back to back to back. So just keep in mind you don't have to, once you put in the minutes, that's all you need. It's going to run all the zones in order at that time that you tell it. Okay, So let's regroup. What are the three things that we have now discussed that we have? First one are minutes and hours to run each station. We talked about for your lawn and your drip. Typically, you're going to be programming in minutes for your lawn zones, and you're going to be programming in hours for your drip zones. How often to run? We talked about this. This is your days. You're going to see the days of the week or a frequency, like we'll talk about. That's basically how often. And typically throughout the year, all you're going to be doing is stretching those days either further apart or closer together. And then the time of day to run. These are our start times. We want to tell the controller what time of day to run. Okay, so now we can actually input some test programs in our controller. Okay, so now we're at the controller. This particular model is a rain dial. Irrigation is the brand on this. It's a pretty common controller, but don't worry if you don't have this one. All these parameters are on all your home irrigation controllers. So the first one over here on the right-hand side, station run times, where our minutes go. Start times, this is where our AM, PM start time we tell it to start. And then over here you see our days of the week. So we're going to be utilizing all of these. One thing to keep in mind is double checking your time. Make sure that this time is the current time, because otherwise your controller will not run at the time that you think it's supposed to run. And that could get changed in power outages and things like that accidentally. Okay, our first one is our lawn program, program A. And what we're going to do is, I always like to start with the start time. So you can see our 4 a.m. is our start time. So I'm going to turn this dial all the way down here to start time. And before we make any changes, we need to make sure that we're in the set programs, this particular controller. This is essentially your edit. So usually when you walk up, it's going to be in run, or it'll be in off if you had a rain event. So make sure you're in the middle for set programs. So now we've turned the dial to start time 1. Keep in mind, this is not a zone yet. This is just start time 1. We're using program A up here on the left-hand side, and that's going to be for our lawn. So I'm going to use this plus button. Actually, I'll use the minus button because we want to get to 4 a.m. Each controller is different where the time starts, but basically, if you hit the plus and minus button, you'll get to where you need to go. We've chosen to water our lawn in program A, starting at 4 a.m. And now, our next setting, we want to water 2 days a week. So I've chosen I want to water them on Monday and Thursday. So let's go ahead and turn up to Monday up here. And this particular controller, if you hit the plus button, that'll turn that day on. And you can see our other days should all say off because we don't want the other ones. Now I'm on Thursday, hit the plus button. So now Thursday is on. Friday we're going to leave off. Saturday we're going to leave off. And you could double check your work by just either scrolling through, or if you have this model, just turn the dial and make sure that the only 2 days you have are the ones, those are the only ones that should be on. Okay, now our last setting, we have our start time. We told it 4 a.m. Monday and Thursday. Now the controller needs to know, okay, well, how long and on which zones? So we see that station 1 is our backyard. So that's station 1 right here. We're going to add in 45 minutes. I'm using the plus button. Oops. So sometimes you can see, oh, I went too far. Don't worry. Just go between the plus and minus buttons to get to the amount of minutes that you want. Turn the dial to station 2. And station 2, we've chosen to water for 14 minutes. Use this plus button again to get to 14 minutes. And now station 3, we're not going to program onto A. We're going to use that on a different one. So the rest of these should be off because we only want stations 1 and 2 watering. 45 minutes, 14 minutes for our lawn. Okay. Now we're going to program our drip zone. So that is program B. So before we do anything else, again, make sure you're in the set programs. Then we're going to look at the top left, or if you have a PRG button, go ahead and change this so it's in B instead of A. A we're keeping just for our lawn. So now we get to B, and we've decided we want to water it starting at 6 a.m. So let's go ahead and turn this dial all the way down here. Oh, why does it say off? Didn't we put a time in there? Remember, we're in program B now, so these are clear until we add information in here. B we're going to use for our drip. We've decided to water it at 6 a.m. This particular controller gets me right there pretty quickly, so we have a 6 a.m. start time. The next setting, we said we're going to water once every 9 days. And you look at this and you say, that's impossible. There's only 7 days in the week. Notice right here, this function, skip days. I'm going to go ahead and turn to that. If you have a different model of controller, typically all you have to do is just keep scrolling past all of your days, and you'll see a calendar icon, or you'll see one that says interval. That's what we're trying to get to. And now what I can do with the plus button, I hit the plus button. Notice what this says now. It says once every. So now if we look at our desired program, we want to water once every 9 days because we have desert adapted plants. So now it says once every 9 days. So now we can actually water further out than a week because we need a deeper soak but not so frequent. This setting is really, really handy because throughout the year, if you have the right amount of minutes and you have the right start time, you just have to change this one setting for each season or each month. Okay, now we have one more setting to do. That is, oh yeah, quick note on here. You'll notice that all these days are grayed out. It says, I don't care what day of the week it is, I'm on skip days, because the day of the week obviously is going to change when you're running it on an every 9-day interval. Okay. So now we need to go over to our station run times. We've decided we're going to water for 4 hours. Station 1, oh, it's off. Why is it off? Didn't we put information in there? Remember, we put that on A. So we should see stations 1 and 2 off on B because we don't want them on B. Turn to station 3. 3 is going to be our drip. Now we're going to use this plus button to take us all the way to 4 hours. So this particular controller translates to hours. You can see it in the top right, it says HR. So now we know we're in an hour setting. And now we've programmed 4 hours. Okay, perfect. Now we are going to program our tree zone. So our trees, we have completed programs A and B. Now we need to make sure we flip down to program C. And again, make sure on this particular model, make sure you're still in set programs. And now we're going to do the same thing again. I'm going to start in the same order. I'm going to go down to start times. So we're at our first start time here. And we decided we want to water it at 2 a.m. So I'm going to use the minus button. In this case, either way you get there, it doesn't matter. Some controllers will move these numbers a lot faster than others. So just kind of be patient with your model, whichever one you have. Okay, so we're going to start with a 2 a.m. start time. Now in this particular one, remember we said we want another start time in here. So what are we going to do? How are we going to get that in here? Well, you'll notice there's 3 slots for start times. So I'm going to turn this to this other one. And now we're on start time 2. Is this station 2? No. This is just a second start time related to program C. So I'm going to add this one in. We decided we want to water at 8 p.m. So I think I'll go this way. It'll be faster on this particular model here. Let's take us to 8 p.m. So we're going to water once at 2 a.m. and then once at 8 p.m. The controller is going to automatically pick this up. So now you'll see there's a 2 a.m. that we input, and there's your 8 p.m. Okay, excellent. Now we're going to go to our days. We're going to use this same function, the skip days function, because we want to water once every 15 days. So I'm going to use this plus button again to take us all the way to once every 15 days. Okay, since we're watering so infrequently, we know we're going to have a good amount of run time on there. So now we have our last setting. We're going to turn this dial all the way to our station run times. Again, station 1 and 2 are our lawn. Those are on A. We don't want any minutes on this one. Station 3 is our drip for our shrubs. So that, again, that one's on B. So it's good that these are all clear. Station 4 is our trees. So that's the one we're going to input here on program C. And we decided we're going to run it for 3 hours. So I'm going to take this up. Now, I went too far, but that's okay. Just try it again. I'm going to take it up to 3 hours. So it'll run for 3 hours at 2 a.m. and then again it'll run 3 hours at the second start time we selected at 8 p.m. So then we are all complete, and you could turn this wherever you want. The controller doesn't really care where this sits. We input information into all A, B, and C, so it's going to run all that information. It doesn't matter where this switch sits. However, the most important switch you have to remember is this one down here. When you're finished, make sure you turn it back to run. If you have another controller, make sure you turn it back to automatic if there's an automatic setting. And then another quick note to keep in mind, anytime there's rain or if we had a really cold streak and you want to just turn the system off, you could just go over here, turn your whole system off. Don't worry, your program is not lost. Everything we put in there still exists. When we turn it back to run, it just picks right back up again. And you are all completed with programming your irrigation controller. What does that look like if you wrote it all down on an Excel sheet or on a notepad? Our first program, we're watering on Monday and Thursday. We have a start time of 4 a.m. and you can see stations 1 and 2. 1 is 45 minutes, 2 is 15 minutes, 3 and 4 are 0 minutes. Why are they 0 minutes? Remember, they're not on program A. Program B, we're watering once every 9 days for our shrubs at 6 a.m. And you can see stations 1 and stations 2, 0 minutes. So make sure that when you're under each of the specific programs, the minutes are not duplicated. Otherwise, it's going to run more than you intend it to. You only want your specific zone attached to that program to be running when you're looking at the minutes. So all of them are 0 except for station 3 because that is our shrubs. Similarly, program C we're using for our trees once every 15 days. We have the 2 start times, and we have no minutes in any of them except station 4 where we are running for 3 hours. One last point that I'd like to make about watering with multiple start times, which you can also do this on your lawn. If you are seeing a lot of ponding or flooding, then I would recommend using your start times and adding a second one and just cutting your minutes in half. So it's a little bit of a complicated thing when you think about it, but the main idea is if you're getting a lot of runoff, but you still need to do a deep soak, then say, okay, well, I'm going to start by watering 1 time and then take a break and add a second time in there. And that concludes our irrigation controller programming. Thank you for attending our virtual workshop today.